Hello and welcome to the Spikes podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week we have Spikes deputy editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spikes columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, the Oppression Olympics, trans patients in NHS wards, and the hounding of a pro-Brexit trade unionist. So, Tokyo 2020 has come to a close, and there's been something of a culture war over the meaning of the Olympic spirit, I think it's fair to say. There have been some spectacular sporting performances as ever, but most of the commentary has tended to focus on the athletes' identity, their mental health, and in some cases, the fact that they're not even taking part at all. I mean, Tom, what are some of your highlights and lowlights from this?
Well, as you say, I mean, Mick Hume has made this point on Spike since the Olympics began, is that they always start under this kind of fog of controversy, talk about corruption. I mean, even London 2012, I mean, you tweeted this the other day, Fraser. People remember it as this great coming together for the nation. There was so much whinging, even about relatively low-level things like parking or whatever, you know, in the run-up to
It's going to be terrible. We're going to embarrass ourselves in front of the whole world.
All this sort of stuff. Going into Tokyo 2020, you know, delayed because of the pandemic, obviously, it seemed to be so much worse because obviously you had the pandemic going on, most citizens of Japan not even wanting it to go ahead, no fans in stadiums. You had a nasty outbreak of cancel culture in the organising committee in the days beforehand. You know, the guy who was directing the opening ceremony, I believe, you know, sacked because of a joke he told 23 years ago, all of this kind of stuff.
Sacked the day before the opening ceremony.
It just felt like it was going to be a mess. And then, of course, as we all know, woke politics infects everything. But it did feel like we were starting to break through all of that, even from last week with all the Simone Biles stuff, which I'm sure we'll come back to in a second, because of just the sporting excellence on display. That always cuts through. You know, that Norwegian hurdle jumper, was his name, Karsten Warholm, beating his own world record in the 400-metre hurdles. You know, a feat so superhuman, he literally rips open his own shirt at the end. Charlotte Worthington, the Team GB BMX, doing that crazy backflip 360, which I think really actually even doubters like myself who are wondering why BMX is in the Olympics kind of, you know, gives you pause. It definitely should be there more than the horse dancing or whatever it's called in my view at this point. Much more Olympian. But you can't help but get away from the fact that the things that this games are going to be remembered for are Simone Biles dropping out of a number of her events, citing her mental health, and that being celebrated almost as the ultimate victory, which is quite interesting. And Laurel Hubbard, who was presented as the great history maker of the games, for competing as a trans woman in the women's category, also the oldest person ever to compete. I thought it was telling that the person who ended up winning the gold from China was 21 years old. Tells you something about why you divide these sports in that respect. That's really being talked up as the great difference in these games. Some of those achievements have kind of been put to the side. Yeah. And it's just a bit unfortunate, I think, because, you know, you can't help but keep politics, and our cultural discussions can't help but kind of colour sporting events. But it shouldn't completely overtake them. You know, this shouldn't be the means through which we actually reward and honour people, but it seems like we're getting towards that place to some extent.
Yeah, definitely. And Simone Biles is probably the archetypal example of that, where, you know, most of her events she in the end didn't compete in. I mean, Ella, you wrote a bit about this, how especially for women in particular, it seemed as if their sporting achievements were being overshadowed.
It was always one of those uncomfortable things that, you know, a lot of commentators want to say something about the Olympics, but they don't necessarily know very much about sport, and I mean, me included. But rather than just kind of leave the Olympics as something kind of sacred, actually, about focusing on the human body, you know, the human kind of mentality of being able to get yourself in that mindset for competition, and talking about that, there always has to be, try and kind of force some kind of either cultural narrative or, you know, therapy culture narrative onto it. And that's what happened, particularly with women. You had, actually, in Team GB, lots of women coming forward and doing amazing things, like the Charlotte Worthington BMX backflip in 360 flip. The reason why it was so terrifyingly unbelievable, because it was the second time she'd ever done it on the wooden floor. And so she tried it out once before the Olympics and thought, Jesus, this is really like terrifying. I'm a bit scared, but screw it, I'm going to do it anyway. And then won. And, you know, what an amazing thing to do. You know, Emily Campbell getting silver in the weightlifting, Sky Brown, who's 12 or something, doing, again,
13,
skateboarding, and, you know, my prejudice, like you, Tom, thinks skateboarding.
It's not Greco-Roman wrestling.
Yeah, but, you know, here's a young person who's pushing the limits, and it's amazing. And women doing these things. I mean, the 100-meter sprinter from Jamaica, who it has that kind of aggressive, competitive, really attractive mentality that Usain Bolt has. It just is like showing off in front of the cameras. It's brilliant to watch. All of that gets sidelined by the discussion about Simone Biles' mental health, about, even someone like Dina Asher-Smith's mental health, and about how, that, I think, quite exploitative post-race interview where it was like her emotions were on display and everyone was saying how great it is that she could be open about how upset she is. We should be talking about women's achievements and when women succeed rather than when women fail. I mean, we talked about this in one of the last podcasts. There's a real aversion to accepting that failure is a part of the Olympics. Inevitably, all the athletes know that, but instead you've got to turn failure into this sort of human feat about mental health, when actually that's a place for a different discussion, not the rough and tumble of the Olympics that's meant to be about winning medals. That's what you're there to do.
And there was even a kind of, not just failure has seemed to be valorised, but the taking part in and of itself has been valorised more than ever before. Yeah. Now, that's always been a big part of the Olympics. It is obviously an honour simply to be there. But even the slogan of the Olympics was changed this year. It's been harder, faster, stronger since the modern Olympics existed. And now we have together added to it. And we saw this in some sporting events where, the high jump, where the Italian and Qatari high jumpers effectively decided to share their medal rather than compete for the gold. And isn't this just kind of downgrading what it means to be sporting excellence? Isn't sport about winning ultimately?
I mean, yeah, and it's always been a tension in there, obviously, because as you say, Baron de Coubertin, the bloke who set it up in the modern Olympiad, he actually said the words, it's not the winning, it's the taking part, but also gave it that slogan. So there's always been this bit of tension, but you can see in which direction the kind of needle is moving. And it's not just a taking part, it's also being yourself. It's being true to yourself. All of this is kind of crept into it. And I think a distinction that Mick made in one of his pieces recently was to say that, again, you can't keep politics out of sport. It's a bit naive to assume that you can, especially big international competitions, which always have all kinds of different things kind of shrouded over them.
It used to be
naturally.
Geopolitics more than what we're seeing today.
Politics, as it were. But the politics that is creeping into it is anti-Olympian. Yeah. That's the point that he makes. And I think there's a lot to that, because of the fact that, you're celebrating people because of who they are, because of how open they're being, rather than their achievements. And this is something which completely cuts against the grain. So it's a different kind of thing that we're dealing with here. And you can't really keep, politics out of sport, but I think keeping the culture war in its current manifestation out of sport would probably be a good place to start, at least.
And isn't the other difference, because obviously the famous instance of politics creeping into sport is the raised fist in the 1960s. But a lot of the kind of politics is actually coming from the top, coming from the kind of, organizer level, from the corporate sponsor level, particularly, with the rule change this year that you are allowed to do sort of taking the knee style protests. And we saw Raven Saunders do a kind of
shot putter,
to, highlight the intersection of oppressions and things like that. So, it's also not even coming necessarily, it's not being driven by the players, even if they're the ones that are kind of taking part in it.
Yeah, well, that's the difference between raising a fist or, actually, even as we've always said, the initial taking of the knee by Colin Kaepernick. There's something very different from a spontaneous political statement that breaks the rules. And actually, the important thing is about it being a protest that breaks the rules, rather than a protest that's sanctioned by, or even actually mandated by, as we see in football, by a kind of top-down or, by the organisation. And so it's not actually expressing anything that the players or Olympians themselves feel. It's about saying this is the line and you've got to toe it. Yeah. And Laurel Hubbard, the instance of Laurel Hubbard taking part was a really good example of this, because, never mind what you think about Laurel Hubbard taking part, I think there's a very, I agree with the kind of feminists who say that it's very unfair for someone with a body that's benefited from puberty and is obviously quite different in its makeup to women to take part in women's sport and therefore take a woman's place who would otherwise have been competing. But the kind of response to Laurel Hubbard even taking part, despite the fact that she lost, despite the fact she didn't qualify because she didn't even make the set or whatever, however you put it, then the three on the podium, the three women who won medals, were then asked a question saying, what do you think about the fact that Laurel Hubbard has become the first trans person to take part? And there was this kind of deafening silence. Yeah. And it's hard to tell whether it's that they were too scared to say something because they didn't want to be transphobic, or actually I think it was more that they just thought, why the hell are you asking me about this? This is my time to shine.
They might have been quite pissed off about the whole situation.
Ask me about my training routine. Ask me about how I won. Ask me about how, if I don't ask me about someone else. But there you have this other thing, gender politics, trying to come in and artificially intervene into where it shouldn't exist, where it isn't relevant. And for someone like Emily Campbell winning the silver for GB, I mean, she's kind of overshadowed by the fact that, but this is historic thing. Well, what about her historic moment?
I mean, the fact that in those events where Laurel Hubbard and Simone Biles, respectively, barreled out or got the bronze medal, no one knows no one can remember who got the gold in those instances. I think they were both Chinese athletes, as it turned out. No one remembers those things, and I think that's telling, and that's something that's quite striking. And the other thing, which is this implicit or explicit comparison, which always goes on between some of the podium protests we've seen, or at least some of the ones that we've told might take place or happen in some of the qualifying rounds, and Tommy Smith and John Carlos in Mexico in 1968 throwing up the raised fist, is such a ridiculous comparison. Like, first of all, as you guys have said, people are basically being applauded for making these gestures. Those guys were hounded out of athletics for making that statement. And that's something that's definitely worth remembering. Now, the IOC did loosen the rules a little bit. I think they're still kind of holding the line on the idea that the podium should be sacred, but I don't think anyone genuinely believes Raven Saunders is going to be hauled over the coals for this. I think her mother's also just died, which is awful. But it's still the case that there's no risk to doing this in the way that there was then. Also, the political context is so different because we're seeing all of these very ostentatious gestures in relation to questions of racism. It's nothing like it was in 1968. I mean, that Olympics, I think, was just months after Martin Luther King had been assassinated. America was figuratively and literally on fire at the time, and with racial divisions and real racism to an extent that is unimaginable today. So to compare those things, I think, is utterly ridiculous. Aside from anything else, they do not have the potency that they once had. And to suggest otherwise, I think is really, really strange. That's the problem, is that a lot of this isn't making a big political statement. It's virtue signalling, which, as we all know, is a very, very different thing.
Well, absolutely. And it has the backing of the IOC, it has the backing of the corporates. I mean, it's the kind of woke problem in general that we're talking about. Poses as radical, but is really, very much part of the establishment, very much supported by the authorities. We should talk a bit more about Laurel Hubbard, I think. It's fascinating to see the sort of BBC producing a sort of 3,000-word hagiography, the reluctant history maker, and then basically threatening to report anyone to the police if they said anything mean in response.
Completely remarkable. I mean, for an organisation like the BBC that ties itself in so many knots trying to be politically neutral and goes on about the importance of objectivity, to essentially, like you say, threaten their followers by saying that if anyone even kind of, says something vaguely negative about Laurel Hubbard, whether that's that you disagree with her as a trans person being in this category, or you just think she's actually a crap weightlifter, whatever your opinion is, if you kind of disagree with us, or if you say something critical, we will report you to the relevant authorities. So, or block you. There was a gradient of punishments that they laid out. But that, the kind of sensitivity, I think that's the most interesting thing, the sensitivity to having any kind of criticism of an athlete is very telling, because if Laurel Hubbard, who knows, is, I don't think that she's doing it on the basis of trying to screw up women's sport.
No.
I think that there's been there was a slightly uncomfortable desire, I think, among some gender critical feminists of wanting her to get through and almost wanting her to win so that they can be like, look how unfair it is. Which is, an Olympian is there because they want to win medals, and that should be respected. But also, you can't go in and do something as controversial and I think as wrong as take part in a women's sport when you very obviously have a physical advantage in the way that people who are born with male bodies and go through puberty have, without expecting some pushback. There's this real denial of the idea of what is kind of commonplace, normal view of sport. And there have been countless people like, Martina Navratilova and all these sort of people have come forward and said, hang on a minute, we have to be able to talk about this, not be nasty online, but we have to be able to talk about this. And for the BBC to not realise that and BBC Sport, which has millions of followers, to not be able to realise that this is, actually criticism and a reluctance to being so sensitive to criticism is part of sport. You when you compete, you expect people to say armchair slobs to say you're crap. That's part of what you do.
But it's also just the attempts to dampen down criticism about this, or to cast aspersions about people who raise issues with this. It's fundamentally ridiculous, because you could be completely supportive of trans rights, of trans people's right to, you know, have a good life, to be as free as humanly possible as anyone to be, and recognise that there's a problem with someone who's been through male puberty competing in women's sports. I mean, it's just obvious. I mean, you have to ignore the evidence of your own eyes to think that this isn't a problem.
Yeah.
It's clearly not just about testosterone levels. That was the big rule change back in 2015, I think, which allowed Laurel Hubbard to be able to progress onto the Olympics. You know, if you watch some of the mixed relay events in like the swimming and the running and whatever that have taken place this year, and you see, depending on how they've kind of sequenced it team to team, you know, the men tearing up big leads, which then when they hand the baton over or tag in the woman, things slow down. Like, it's obvious.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It doesn't undermine the achievements of the women, of course not, but this is why you make these kinds of distinctions. And to pretend that this stuff isn't a problem is ridiculous. I mean, even, I think her name was Joanne Harper, is a trans academic whose work kind of fed into the IOC's shift in position, said that on balance she supported the Laurel Hubbard's inclusion, but at the same time, you've got to look at this, because if anything, women's weightlifting is one area where you might think this isn't appropriate. So even she will see the nuance in all of this, if you see what I mean. But you're expected to just ignore that because gender ideology has to conquer all before it. And I think particularly when you talk about women's spaces, women's sports, etc., it's almost like the burden of proof is on women to explain why this drastic change cannot happen, rather than the other way around. You know, that's what's really quite strange about all of this.
Are you looking for the perfect gift for the pro-freedom, anti-woke person in your life? Then look no further than the Spiked shop. Tom Slater here is modelling a fantastic cancel culture t-shirt. You can get this or any of your favourite Spiked slogans on a t-shirt, hoodie, tote bag or mug, including ban nothing, question everything, or love Europe, hate the EU. So don't delay, go to the Spiked shop now. And if you're a Spiked supporter, you can get 15% off all of our products. Just go to spiked-online.com/shop now. That's spiked-online.com/shop. You're going to look fabulous. And that brings us nicely on to the other story about gender ideology this week. So the Health Secretary has launched an investigation into NHS guidance on transgender patients after it was revealed that it's possible for male-bodied sex offenders to still be allowed into women's single-sex wards, providing that they identify as women. Now, what do we make of this? Again, is this sort of gender ideology trumping, you know, women's rights, women's safety?
This one is like a really good example of why you need to unpick what's really going on with these rows about, particularly about trans, because the main problem with the NHS is that they promised to have institute single sex wards, you know, over a decade ago. And anyone who's been to a hospital and stayed overnight anytime recently knows that doesn't happen. And it's pretty awful because when you go to hospital and you're staying overnight, you're sick. You're very sick if you're probably staying overnight. You get up to go to the toilet with your gown flapping open, and you want to be a bit like changing rooms, a bit like toilets. You want to be in a place where it's kind of sex segregated and you feel relaxed. And I don't mind if the women in the ward see my ass when I'm going to the toilet, because you're in a very vulnerable position when you are a patient. And so therefore the idea that the NHS would have someone who would just present and say, I am a woman, and perhaps, you know, in certain circumstances look and sound like, have a man's body, then that would throw up problems for the women in that ward potentially. But the kind of, I think one of the things to be careful about this is there's a suggestion that all trans people are, you know, predilected towards bad behavior, which is really where gender critical feminists let themselves down. There's a kind of an idea that anyone who is trans is either got some kind of misogynistic elements to them or is in fact perverted. But also that, you know, the sex offenders thing, fair enough for Sajid Javid to open up an investigation about this. But I mean, are we suggesting that NHS wards demand people's criminal records before they access care? Would it matter if someone was a sex offender a month ago and be convicted, or 25 years ago? You know, do we not believe in redemption anymore and rehabilitation? You know, are you forever a prisoner and a criminal if you've been through the system and come out the other end? So, you know, I think it's a really good example of where you need some nuance and some ability to suggest, you know, vulnerability as a patient. You become a different kind of a citizen when you enter a hospital ward. And that's the same for women. And it's also the same for trans people, because, you know, you shouldn't poo-poo the fact that when someone is in that vulnerable position, it's probably just as upsetting for a trans person to work up in a different sex ward and be surrounded by men or women, trans women, whatever you are. And the most important thing to know is that nurses and doctors have been dealing with this informally for years. and have been very sensitive about it for years. And so it feels a little bit like a panic over something that have a little bit more nuance to it.
But I think the difference here is the fact that we're talking about a question of kind of, it's beyond the question of dignity as well, because it's about the sort of question of safety. Because this is the thing in relation to women's prisons, where obviously there's been very horrendous high profile cases of male bodied people who have been convicted of rape and sexual assault getting into women's prisons and, you know, continuing to commit those acts. There is obviously a concern here with something similar repeating itself. And I don't think that you have to not believe in redemption or believe that all trans people are potential sex offenders or believe that all men are potential sex offenders that happens. I know there's a fair amount of feminists who believe all of those things. But nevertheless, to think that this is fundamentally a problem, because it's not to say that all these people are perverts, male, trans women, whatever, and therefore you've got to keep them away from women. It's to suggest that that loophole, if you create it, can and will be exploited, often by people who aren't trans, probably. I mean, this is the thing. It's not to suggest that this is going to happen en masse, but it's for things like this why there are sex-based rights and sex-based spaces, is to not hold back the kind of abusing hordes, trans woman, male or whatever. It's because in these certain circumstances, people do want that extra level of dignity, but also that extra level of protection. And when you look at some of the details, I think it was a Telegraph investigation that pulled this out, singling out, I think it was Devon and Oxford and Nottinghamshire, where again, even a record as a sex offender will not necessarily bar you from a women's ward, and that there's just some mitigation which is mooted. Are they on anti-libidinal medication, all this sort of stuff? That's concerning in and of itself. But the other thing is, as we all know, the NHS is very stretched, and some of the quotes they have from people working on these wards is that we don't have time to do these risk assessments. So even if you want to kind of go into this sort of halfway house on this particular issue, it's obvious that this sort of thing isn't going to happen. Now, is this going to lead to a kind of torrent of horrendous stories? Of course not. But at the same time, it just shows that this willingness to just sort of bow down to gender ideology, even in situations where just common sense dictates this is probably not a good idea, is quite shocking. And it's just the sort of thing where we need to make clear that there's an importance to these spaces, and it's not about smearing all trans people. It's really not. It's just about this. There's a reason that such spaces exist. And as you were saying, there was a reason that from 1997 onwards, every health secretary has said, we're going to get sex-based wards. We're going to actually achieve it. It's because it's an important thing that people want, both for dignity and for safety. So to just throw that out, as seems to be happening, is quite interesting. It would be interesting to see if a health secretary ever repeated that pledge again for this particular reason, because it would just be too controversial.
And I think, there's always a balance to be struck, isn't there? And every time we discuss this issue on this podcast, we always say that if, in personal lives, it's obviously correct to respect people's, chosen pronouns, chosen identity, chosen name, of course. It would be completely and utterly deranged if you didn't, and just plain rude. But at the end of the day, when you're balancing that in places where there are, safety questions, dignity questions, is that really going to be the thing that trumps those issues? I just don't think it can be.
Well, it comes down to you have two warring factions, or perhaps not warring factions, but you've got two things to consider. You've got the trans person who's presenting and saying, I want to be in this, I want to, for the example of trans women, I want to be in a woman's ward, but looks ostensibly like a man. And then you've got to balance that with the women who don't want to be in a ward with someone who looks like a man.
And that's another piece of that investigation, which is quite unfortunate as well, is the detail about, actually pushing back against patients, potentially in some cases, I think it's stopped now, depriving care to patients who want to push back against that. That's the sort of nasty other side.
And, a nurse or a doctor, and particularly nurses who have to manage the wards, also have to juggle the fact that most wards, particularly ones that aren't in London, are stretched anyway. And you'd win the lottery if you got a private room. So you have to juggle all these things. But to suggest that, I think the thing that really just gets my goat is that either you say that everyone has a criminal record check before, because I could be a sex offender. There's not,
I have heard things.
Or are you comfortable being on a ward with someone who's got a criminal record for theft and is going to pinch your purse when you go to the loo? Either you do a criminal record on everyone, which I think we'd all agree is we don't want the NHS to be doing, or you're suggesting that because people are trans and you have a prejudice about what trans people do and are like, then you suggest they have a criminal record. I think what's a much better way of dealing with this and less illiberal is to say that both sides, and actually you're right, most of the time it's the kind of the side of trans activists who want to just without question shove their preferences down people's throats, being respectful, even though that sounds wishy-washy, and saying that in a specific place like hospital hospital care or vulnerable places like changing rooms, prisons, that a little bit of being able to understand that your personal preferences aren't always going to be met, and actually they're not sacred, that everything, there has to be a informal debate about these things. And if you have to go onto a ward that you don't want to go into, that's life. Anyone who's been to a hospital in the UK knows that you don't get to go on wards you want to go to. You're usually on a trolley somewhere. So like a little bit of perspective
NHS
in this
is a bit
more
like a bit like hospitals in the developing world than any kind of advanced country, but there we are. Right, so let's wrap this podcast up with the final story. Paul Embery, friend of Spike's, has won his unfair dismissal case after he was sacked from the Fire Brigades Union for giving a pro-Brexit speech. Tom, do you want to fill us in?
Yeah, so it's a just end to quite a sorry episode, I think, from the whole Brexit wars. So Paul Embery, who was a high-ranking official in the Fire Brigades Union, had been a firefighter since 1997, very involved in the union for more than 10 years, so very much committed, and committed the sin, essentially, of attending and speaking at the Leave Means Leave rally, which was on the 29th of March 2019. That was the kind of original Brexit day, the original end of the first Article 50 period and all the rest of it. Brenda O'Neill also spoke there, Claire Fox, Kate Hoey, Nigel Farage, which is where he got in trouble, really. And even though he spoke as a representative of trade unionists against the EU, he did this on his own time. He didn't mention his union whatsoever. It was alleged that he had essentially committed gross misconduct by sharing a platform with people who shouldn't be shared a platform with, for contradicting the union's anti-Brexit policy, and also for failing to basically exempt the FBU from his general criticisms in the speech of the Labour movement, which is to say, when are you going to get on the side of the people rather than big business, which is a completely fair point. And they investigated and they suspended him. They barred him from office for 2 years, and he's now won this employment tribunal. And what's fascinating about the ruling is that it's just so categorical. I mean, it talks about the fact, it's worth making a distinction. It says, just as a point of fact, that he wasn't dismissed because of his pro-Brexit views. It was for attending this rally. But the picture it paints really is one of an attempt quite clearly to get him really from the higher ups at the FBU. I mean, the quotes in there are amazing. The judge refers to it as a witch hunt, as a fishing exercise with a predetermined outcome. Some of the evidence they heard about Matt Rack, who's the general secretary there, accusing him in meetings of emboldening the far right, another high-ranking official saying he's out to get you, essentially all this kind of stuff. And it's really shocking on its own terms. But I think the thing that makes this of broader interest is the fact that throughout all of this, a firefighter and a trade unionist being thrown under the bus by his own union, essentially for attending a pro-leave rally, is that most of the Labour movement just looked at their shoelaces.
Yeah.
They didn't really say anything about this. He got a lot of support, it seems like, from rank and file FBU members and other people in the Labour movement. But aside from there's like a few articles in the Mirror, there was a few prominent people who came out in support of him, but everyone kind of ignored him. And then he also became a target of kind of twatty, posh Corbynistas who would initiate pylons against him for increasingly tenuous reasons from time to time. So I think in all of this, it kind of actually proved some of the points that Paul was making in his speech at that rally, which is to say that the left have abandoned Euroscepticism, become incredibly intolerant, sided with the establishment, but also, as we see, just abandoned any kind of sense of dissent as well, which is another one of his criticisms. So, yes, I'm sure it's quite bittersweet insofar as what a horrendous thing to go through, but at the same time, vindicates a lot of the points that he's been making for the past few years.
Yeah, Ella, that's what I wanted to put to you, actually. I mean, what does this tell us about the broader left? The abandonment of free speech, democracy, their kind of complete aversion to Brexit was very strange to a lot of people.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, don't want to downplay what Paul's been through. It's no one should have had to go through that. And, for him, financially, emotionally, everything, his life got turned upside down and it's terrible. But, I think if you were to pull a silver lining from it, it has vindicated everything he said. And he now has this example of saying everything that actually he talked about on that platform at that rally, because I was in the crowd, about the fact that, he bemoaned the absence of left-wing viewpoints on this. I mean, he was actually kind of, in his interviews and everything he's talked about in Brexit, he said, part of the problem is that this discussion gets co-opted by people like Nigel Farage. And if you don't want Brexit to become a Faragey type thing, which all the left have so cowardly claimed it has been all the way through, then you've got to stand up. All you Eurosceptics in the Labour movement have got to stand up and come forward. But of course, we know that in 2016, they didn't, that Corbyn and Owen Jones and all these people who were previously supposedly Eurosceptic. Owen
Jones, the coiner of Lexit. No?
Ducked out when it really mattered. And so you have this kind of, and then this is where I divide with Paul, because Paul still wants to try and rehabilitate Labour as a vehicle through which you could kind of rehabilitate some of these backward feelings. But actually, what I think it proved is, particularly with the division between the rank and file FBE members and the officials, is that this has never been, unions are no longer, and particularly the unions that are sort of almost Romaniac now, which many of them were, we saw in the referendum.
Which is a bizarre statement.
Are no longer about looking at what it is that working class interests are, what it is, the way in which working class people are talked about, which in the context of Brexit was like you were kind of like second class citizens if you voted for Brexit. Instead, it's about playing up to a kind of either the identity politics outlook or the kind of middle class protectionist sort of Europhile view of the Remainer side. And so, if we can learn a lesson from Paul Embery, it's that the left, and particularly the Labour left, it doesn't exist anymore in any kind of meaningful way. It doesn't stand for anything sort of progressive. What it really is a kind of clinging on to authority by means of these kind of disassociated from their members, Remainer, middle class, woke, whatever you want to call it, kind of factions that don't have much play in the world other than trying to get their officials who disagree with them sacked. So it's a sorry tale, and solidarity with Paul. I'm glad that he won his case, but there shouldn't be more Paul Emberys. There shouldn't be more cases like this. We should learn from it.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back right here next Friday. And to make sure you never miss an episode, why not hit the subscribe button and click the bell? In the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other content at spiked-online.com.